Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Whiteboard Friday. I'm Austin, the CEO and co-founder of Lambda School, and today we're talking about what it's like to be a junior engineer. So one of the questions we get asked a lot is, what is it actually like day to day as a junior engineer? And one of the reasons that's a difficult question to answer is because what defines a junior engineer depends on which company you're talking to, or frankly, which person you're talking to. In my mind, a junior engineer is somebody who's just starting out and who doesn't have anybody under them, which would make them a senior engineer. But different companies use different definitions. At some companies, it's a matter of how long you've been programming. At some companies, they say we don't hire junior engineers, but they'll still hire people out of college and code boot camps. They just say you're a senior engineer. It's kind of all a little fuzzy. But generally speaking, most people that graduate from Lambda School, you're going into your first engineering job, you're not going to have people underneath you. It's safe to call that a junior engineer. So a lot of people wonder, when I show up on day one, what is that actually going to be like? Am I, shipping code to the production code base in the first 30 minutes? And the reality is that most companies have a pretty long process that they'll ease you in over. So for example, if you go work at Facebook, they have something they call a boot camp that I'm not sure how many weeks it is. I want to say it's 4 weeks. But no engineer, no matter how experienced, ever touches a line of code until they go through Facebook's internal boot camp. Of course, that's not a code boot camp the way you normally think of it. That's just Facebook trying to get you ramped up to speed with how Facebook operates. And most have something vaguely similar. Even after the interview process, there's not a really great understanding of where you are as an engineer. There's still a lot of things you need to understand before you're ready to ship production code. So there's usually a little bit of ramp up. How long that is depends on the company. So now let's talk a little bit about what surprises most engineers when they show up on day one. You finally got the job, you show up, you have the day of onboarding where you give your payroll and benefits information and you work out all the minutia. Now you're at your desk, you're ready to write code. What is that experience usually like? The first thing that we see from most people is a shock at the code base. We try to have you working on big code bases as much as we can within Lambda School, but almost no matter what company you go to, there are probably hundreds of thousands of lines of code, if not millions of lines of code, and it's this big convoluted application that you don't understand and you've never dealt with. The first and one of the most difficult things a junior engineer has to do is begin to understand what does what within that code base. Depending on how well it's been written, depending on what languages and framework it's written in, it might be totally different than what you're used to. And that's just something that it's part of life. And even if you're a senior engineer joining a new company, you'll see different pieces of code and different folders on your text editor, and you won't know what all of it does. That's totally normal, and companies try to have a good on-ramp process to help you understand all of that. So definitely one of the first things that people say is, whoa, that is a lot of code. I don't understand what it's all doing. It's a huge code base. Maybe it's in a format that I'm not familiar with. Maybe it's in a language or a framework that I'm not used to. That's just part of life as a junior engineer, and that's why you get paid the big bucks, is so that you can figure all that stuff out and start to wrap your head around little pieces of it. Another thing that you will inevitably encounter is almost every junior engineer ends up working in a new language or a new framework, and at a minimum, new kind of standards and processes that they're not used to. Even though everybody uses JavaScript to some degree, even if you go to somebody that uses the exact same stack that you trained for, they might use it in a little bit different of a way than you're used to. So the most important thing, and this is why we drill it so hard in Lambda School, is you have to learn how to learn. Because no matter what company you join, the first little while is going to be learning how that company operates, how they use their code, what languages and frameworks they're using, what their practices are, what style guides they use, all of that stuff. There's no way you can be trained for every company. So that's just part of life, is getting up to speed. Luckily, companies generally understand that that's the case, and they have processes in place to help you get up to speed. They'll assign you a mentor usually that'll help you, understand what's going on in the code base. Usually they'll assign you a small project. Maybe it's not even part of the main application. Maybe it's bug fixing, something to get your feet wet and kind of get up to speed. But that's part of life as a junior engineer, is learning a lot of new stuff really quickly. So now let's talk about how to be a great junior engineer. And I think one of the semi-controversial things I would say that most people don't talk about is that nobody actually wants to hire a junior engineer. And I mean that in a very specific sense. They want to hire people that can move from being junior engineers to full engineers and senior engineers relatively quickly. So if you're a junior engineer and a year after you were hired, you're still dealing with the same problem, still building toy applications that aren't touching the real product. If you're not actually contributing to the core code base, I would start to get a little bit worried. Your goal should be to get in, get effective as fast as you can, and start actually contributing helpful lines of code as quickly as you can. Now, that's not always easy, especially if you're a junior engineer. There's a lot to wrap your mind around and a lot to learn. But there are a few things that you can make sure to do to make sure that you're helpful and not detracting from the work of the rest of the team. The first thing that we've talked about already is just learn fast. It's important to know how to learn by the time you go in so you can wrap your mind around what's happening, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Open up the application, open up all the different folders, and have somebody sit down with you and explain to you what the different elements of the code do. Have them walk through the database, have them walk through the controller, have them walk through the view layer, and really understand where the different pieces interact. Some of the best companies will have it all diagrammed so you can study that. Some don't. But getting to know the code base and getting to know the practices is the first important thing to do. Another thing that I would be really careful to make sure I understand is how that company uses Git. I would assume almost all companies are using Git or some other source of control flow. Most companies will have a very regimented practice about how you submit pull requests, the syntax you use in your commit messages, how you branch, how you merge, all of that stuff. Just open up the code base, look at the previous commits, look at what everybody else is doing, look at what's getting merged in, ask people, how do we use Git here? And that's probably one of the main ways that junior engineers kind of go off the beaten path, is they're used to using Git in a specific way. It's a little bit difficult to think about how to use Git in a new way if you haven't used it before. But generally, it's the same clone, branch, pull request process that we use from day one in Lambda school. So you're at least used to the basics. Just make sure that you understand the minutia. Even little stuff like, do we use past, present, or future tense in commit messages? That stuff becomes really important. If you really want to have a gold star next to your name, understand how they use Git and work seamlessly into the Git flow. And make sure that you're not doing anything wrong there, and you will be a hero, because that's really rare in the world of junior engineering. The last thing that you'll hear a lot of engineers talk about is don't break the build. That can mean a few things. In some companies, that means don't push code that is going to break everything else. So somebody who's really good with Git will have to go back in and remove your commit and fix everything else. Along those lines, be very, very careful when you're dealing with a production database or even a test database, especially when you're running commands with sudo. The worst case scenario, and it will happen to almost every engineer, is you end up overwriting some piece of production data. Most companies have safeguards in place so that that's not possible, but especially in the first few weeks, if there's ever concern, I would imagine most of you aren't writing rewrites to databases regardless, but just get somebody else to double check, make sure you're sanitizing all your database inputs. Don't screw anything up. You can go online and Google and find all sorts of stories about how companies deleted years or hundreds of thousands of lines of code and hundreds of thousands of lines of data from the database because some junior engineer ran a pseudo code with RM, RF when he shouldn't have. So just beware of that, and don't, that's just one thing to be aware of, that you don't screw anything up. The last thing that you need to be very careful with when you are at a new company is dealing with keys, specifically API keys and any credentials like that. Make sure they're not posted publicly to your GitHub account. Make sure that you have two-factor auth built in when you're using anything that touches the code base, and you should be fine. Most companies, again, have safeguards in place that make it difficult for you to push code public, but it's always a little bit awkward when you end up pushing a key to GitHub and then it becomes publicly discoverable, and the whole company has to go through and change their API keys. So that's something that rarely happens, but just beware that when you're dealing with sensitive encrypted credentials, that's something you want to avoid. Generally speaking, every student that graduates from Lambda School will be just fine. We have worked backwards from knowing what it's like to being a junior engineer to building the curriculum. So what we love to hear is day one, somebody shows up and their supervisors are actually surprised at how able they are to write code, how able they are and how quickly they are to contribute to core features of the team. And if you want to begin progressing in your career, that's the best way to do it. If you can show up on day one, if you're ready to write code that's beneficial, your value to the company just became much, much bigger than the average junior engineer. And that's what you should shoot for. So yeah, that's kind of a rough overview of what to expect in life as a junior engineer. There's ramp up, there's new code bases, there's new languages, there's new processes. They might use Git differently, but once you wrap your mind around all of that, being a contributing member to a team is incredibly valuable. So we look forward to hearing about your success in the near future. Thanks so much.